Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture covers some of the other marine mammals that we haven't yet explored. So in previous lectures, we covered the pinnipeds and the cetaceans, the two major groups of marine mammals. Here, we'll look at some of the other marine mammals that maybe are a little bit lesser known because they have fewer representatives. And that includes the sirenians and some of the other members of the order Carnivora, including the otters and the polar bears. So let's get started with the sirenians. The sirenians include the manatees and the dugong. So there are actually 3 species of manatees still in existence along with the dugong. These animals are fully aquatic, as you can tell by their body plan. In other words, they have no appendages that would indicate they can haul out on land. So when we take a look, we see a lot of convergence. There's that convergent evolution again with the cetacea, even though the sirenians belong to their own distinct order and evolved independently of the cetaceans. So in this picture here, we have 2 manatees. The upper 2 pictures are the manatees, and the lower one is the dugong. The order Sirenia evolved probably around 50 million years ago. This puts them in the same class as the cetacea, which also evolved around 50 million years ago. So both the Sirenia and the cetacea make up the oldest marine mammals. It's probably no coincidence that the sirenians and the cetacea are also the only fully aquatic marine mammals. In other words, they do not and cannot come out onto land anymore. So along with these fully aquatic marine mammals, this other group, it's interesting to think about who their ancestors might have been. And the closest living relatives of the sirenians are going to be the elephants. So when we look at some of the eating habits of the sirenians, especially since they are primarily herbivores and they feed on grasses, when we think of elephants eating, we see that same type of grass herbivore feeding, and so it's probably no surprise that they are related. And of course, the sirenians are actually quite large and they're slow. They're very docile, and they also tend to live in shallow coastal waters because that's where their food source is. In order for plant-like material to grow in the ocean, it has to be very close to the surface in order to get enough sunlight. If there's not enough sunlight, the plants won't grow. So because the food sources are located very close to the surface, the sirenians are also inhabit coastal shallow waters. As I mentioned before, there are only 4 existing species. There's 3 species of manatee and then, of course, the dugong. Now, interestingly, conservation of these gentle giants is mostly threatened by interactions with humans. Because humans also like the coast and shallow and warm waters, there's a lot of interactions between boats and the manatees in particular. And in Florida, where there's a nice population of manatees, I'm not sure that there's a single adult manatee out there that doesn't bear markings of some type of injury from encounter with a boat, including propellers, mostly propellers, although occasionally it can be fishing gear as well. So it's not, in fact, it's all too common to see manatees with propeller marks or scars somewhere on their body. And of course, it's a major source of mortality. So when we look at conserving the sirenians, really what we need to do is try to minimize the interaction of boats with the sirenians. Now that we've finished with the sirenians, let's turn to the order Carnivora. Now, the order Carnivora is made up of carnivores. That's what carnivora means, which of course means meat eating. So obviously different than the herbivores, which are plant eating. So marine mammals that belong to this order include the pinnipeds, which are a diverse group of predators, feed mostly on fish and squid and octopi. And then we have the marine otters, which tend to be more generalist feeders. They feed on a diverse assortment of organisms, a lot of invertebrates. And then we have the polar bear, which is considered to be an apex predator. And an apex predator means that they are at the very top of their food chain. Polar bear's favorite food is actually other pinnipeds, including the ringed seal. So let's take a look at the marine otters and the polar bear, which we haven't yet explored. Now, I use the word marine otter somewhat loosely. I mean otters that inhabit the marine environment, not that marine otter is a particular name. And that is because of the 13 existing otter species, 6 of them actually do inhabit the marine environment in some way, shape, or form. But there is only one species that is fully aquatic, and that is the sea otter, otherwise known as Anhydra lutris. That's the scientific name. So the sea otter is the only species that we might say is fully aquatic. Now, interestingly, you might notice when you look at these pictures of the sea otter here that you still see appendages that could kind of resemble more land-like appendages with fingers and toes, and there's still webbing in there. And these animals can haul out onto land, though they don't need to. So they are not obligately aquatic. In other words, they don't have to stay in the aquatic environment all the time, though they certainly could get by their entire life without ever hauling out onto land. So these are really the only species of otters that we tend to look at in detail because they are fully aquatic. The modern day sea otter probably evolved somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago, and it's found in the Pacific Ocean only. Now, the otters are going to be an interesting case study towards the end of this lecture series because they actually are great at looking at a bunch of different properties associated with marine mammals, including some of their physiological, anatomical, and conservation aspects that are associated with them. So they are unique in so many ways that we'll explore them in more detail by themselves towards the end of the class. All right, it's important to think about where we would find the otters. Now, the otters, there is only one species, but the otters are found in the Pacific Ocean, of course, along the coast. And we are currently seeing 3 subspecies. There is the Californian sea otter, which is found along the California coast. There's the Alaskan sea otter, which is found from Oregon all the way to the Aleutian Islands. And then there is the Asian sea otter. And notice that they are in distinct areas, and so there is no current crossbreeding or gene flow between these subspecies. So we would expect that if given enough time, they would eventually evolve into their own species where they were incapable of crossbreeding and making a viable offspring. And of course, that's our classic definition of a species. You basically have a group of organisms that can mate and produce viable offspring or reproductively fertile offspring, and when they can't do that anymore, they're considered to be different species. So finally, let's go to our last member, the polar bear. The polar bear is going to be the largest of the bear species. It evolved approximately 1.3 million years ago from the grizzly bears, but interestingly, we just talked about being able to separate out species by their ability to not crossbreed. Here's the exception. The polar bears and the grizzly bears can still mate and produce living offspring. Such events have happened in the wild at least once that we're aware of, and several times in captivity. We call these offspring growler bears, and they truly look like a hybrid of a polar bear and a grizzly bear. So that's a rather interesting exception to the species rule. Even though they still can mate, there are some distinct anatomical differences of polar bears, and they are considered to be a separate species from the grizzly bears. So the polar bears are actually not very robust swimmers. In fact, they do spend most of their time out of the water. So it's interesting to think, why do we call these marine mammals? And it's because of our definition of marine doesn't mean that it actually has to be liquid water. It turns out that polar bears prefer to spend all of their time on sea ice, and that sea ice comes from the sea, which is still considered to be a marine environment. So the polar bears can swim, although they're not terribly efficient at it, and they do actually prefer to spend most of their time out of the water, where they feed on pinnipeds and occasionally even a walrus or a beluga or a narwhal. So really diverse apex predators. They like to eat big things. And of course, if you know anything about polar bears, you know that polar bears have become the poster animal for global climate change. So starting back in about 2006, Time magazine did a piece about global climate change and had the polar bear as kind of their marks or their poster species that of course is in imminent danger or going to suffer more seriously from global climate change than just about any other species. So let's go ahead and talk about that here. Now, polar bears live on sea ice. They can go to areas where there are no ice, but they tend not to feed. So they fast during those times. So if a polar bear has a choice, they're going to feed all year round because, of course, you want to eat all year round. You don't want to starve during any time of the year, although they can for limited periods of time. So you would want to eat all year round, and so you would want to be in the environment where you're going to find your prey. And a polar bear's favorite prey is a ringed seal. And what they do is they wait by these little ice holes that the seals make, and they just wait patiently for a seal to surface, and then they try to basically scoop them up out of the water. Now, with global climate change, we're losing our sea ice. And as we lose more and more sea ice, the polar bears are going to have less and less habitat that they can basically reside in and fish from. And also that habitat is going to be spread farther and farther apart. If they're stuck on an ice floe, that means they're going to have to swim across water to get to another suitable habitat. That makes them expend more energy than they want to expend, and there have even been occasional cases where polar bears have drowned from trying to swim such long distances. So in the next 50 years, up until about 2050, we're probably going to see a drastic loss of Arctic sea ice, and the polar bears are going to be very threatened because of their loss of habitat by that interaction or by that change. And so that covers some of the other marine mammals, and with that, I will see you next time.